Let's look at performance measurement. Again, we are focusing on cost management. As the accountants, we're going to help management run the organization by providing them with information that they can use to plan, direct, and control. We will give them information that they can use to analyze performance, compensate employees, and also consider how they want to strategically run the organization when we're talking about making decisions that affect us on a global or multinational scale. And we're going to look at these in Chapter 23. If I've got any accounting and finance double majors in the room, some of these things that they are going to have seen and will see in additional classes here at UTC. We're going to learn how to do some evaluation ratios and use those to guide us in our performance evaluations. So we've got some objectives, we've got some financial and non-financial performance measures that we can use in relation to our balanced scorecard. Again, I went ahead and did Chapter 19 so that you guys would have those to take a look at already. We will learn how to calculate some measures. Do be able to perform these by yourself. Therefore, being prepared for the test over Chapters 19, 22, and 23. I can assure you, you will be calculating ROI, RI, and EVA on the test. We will analyze key measurement choices in the design of each performance measure. My accounting folks are going to be able to understand that you have got to define the different criteria of the items that you're going to be using in these calculations. You will study the choice of performance targets and design of feedback mechanisms and indicate difficulties that occur when the performance of divisions operating in different countries is compared. Understand the roles of salaries and incentives when rewarding managers, because again, we're going to be evaluating them on their distinct performance, their distinct controllable margins, things that they have the ability to institute and make changes in the way an organization is ran, and therefore they need to be evaluated and rewarded on their performance. We'll talk about the 4 levers of control and why they are necessary. You'll need to definitely be familiar with those as well for the test. Many organizations do record financial and non-financial performance measures for their subunits on a balanced scorecard. We saw many of those in the prior chapter. My advice to you guys is for Chapter 19 and Chapter 23, I would be making myself a list of the 4 different distinct areas or perspectives of the balanced scorecard, and then I would be making myself a list underneath those 4 of some of those financial and non-financial examples that you see throughout those 2 chapters. So again, we've got the financial area, we've got the customer, we've got the internal business processes, and finally, learning and growth. We want to be able to link these items to our strategy, and we want to be able to use these financial and non-financial measures and analyze them against that strategy. We want to know whether or not we are doing things that are going to help the company attain those organizational objectives and goals that have been set out and planned over a long term in that strategic plan. And then based on that evaluation, we may have put into place some incentives to try to additionally motivate those managers, and we need to pay them for that performance. So it requires us to take a look at several steps We need to choose the performance measures that align with the firm's financial goals. So again, what's our strategy? What are our goals and objectives? And then what performance measures that we can keep up with and calculate will help us track our performance. And those are the measures that we need to choose. And I assure you, there's a whole slew of choices that we could make, but we're going to focus on just a few in this particular chapter. Once we have selected the particular measure or measures that we're going to use in our analysis, then we have got to be very specific in regards to the details of how each part of that measure is defined. And you're going to see that as we analyze some of these calculations that we're going to do in Chapter 23. We will choose a target level of performance. Okay, we've got our strategic plan. We know there's certain things that we're going to have to do to make that come to fruition, and we will be able to put out there the goal performance measure and what we think is attainable as to that performance measure, and we're going to use that to compare our actual performance to the actual performance of the particular subunit or the manager who is being evaluated. Sounds easy enough, right? However, it gets a little difficult or hairy, and so we have to be very specific about how we go about doing it. So in this particular chapter, we're going to focus on organizational subunits and how there are some very widely used performance measures that cover an intermediate to long-term horizon. We're going to look at internal financial measures per subunit, and we're going to base these measures on accounting numbers that are routinely reported by accounting organizations, or excuse me, by just organizations in general. So ROI, or return on investment, is one of the ones we will calculate. We will also calculate residual income, or RI. We will also look at EVA, or economic value added. Those three right there are known as returns on investment. We will also look at a fourth one, return on sales. Selecting our subunit operating income as a metric is inappropriate because it obviously differs simply on the differing size of the units. So we're going to have to be very, very specific about the different elements of the measures. So what is this first one? ROI is return on investment. It is an accounting measure of income divided by an accounting measure of investment. This particular one right here is the most widely used. It blends all of the ingredients of profitability. How is that? We have revenues, we have cost, and we have investments, and they're blended into one ratio. So our formula for ROI is income divided by investments. So revenues minus cost equals income, and the investment will define that based on some information. It can be compared to a rate of return on opportunities elsewhere. It's called ROI, and it is used in the evaluation of the performance of a subunit. It is also called the accounting rate of return. So return on investment is also called the accounting rate of return. And here again is what the formula is: income divided by investment. Where income varies by company, this income on the numerator here, many use operating income. However, some may use after-tax basis, and some may use net income. So again, my accounting people, you've got to help management with their information so that they're getting good information to make their decisions. So if you are going to be helping not only calculate these items, you need to make sure that the things going into the calculations are very, very well defined. So again, on the top part, income, we could use operating income, we could use after-tax basis, we could also use just net income. In regards to investment, it refers to the resources or assets used to generate the income. What kind of numbers could we plug in on our bottom number? Some companies use total assets. Some use only assets financed by long-term debt and stockholders' equity. So total assets minus current liabilities. Okay, so again, it's got to be very well defined when you're going to be plugging these numbers into the calculation. ROI is the most popular metric. It blends all the ingredients of profitability, like I just mentioned, revenues, cost, and investment into a single percentage. It may be compared to other return on investments, both inside, historically speaking, or against other subunits, as well as compared to others outside of the firm, competitors, industry averages, etc. It is also called the accounting of rate of return, like I mentioned earlier, or even the accrual accounting rate of return, ARR or AARR. Each subunit can raise their ROI by increasing revenues and or decreasing cost or decreasing the amount of investment. Again, if we happen to be using their asset number, total assets, could they not eliminate some property, plant, and equipment and change their result? Yes, they could. If you are asked any questions on this test or any future test, a word of advice, if you are not given data and you're wondering what a specific manager could do to manipulate the numbers, make yourself up a set of fake numbers and change one or two of them and see what happens to your results, because managers are able to affect change by doing certain things. So consider that. Again, my accounting people, you need to remain professionally skeptical throughout your careers, especially if you are working in the world of performance evaluations and incentive pay. If you're a finance major as well, depending on what route you go, consider what corporate management's able to do with their numbers to get results to be what they want them to be. So if our assets increase, what does it do to our number? What about our operating income? Consider those changes. ROI can provide more insight when it is represented as two components. All right, you guys could check this out. It indicates which investment yields the highest return. We can literally break down ROI into two distinct areas. This first one right here, income over revenues, is what is called return on sales. Know this formula. It's the amount of return or income we're generating as a percentage of the amount of total sales. So again, return on sales. The other half of this is asset turnover. It's the amount of revenues generated per the amount of investment. And these two together, we are able to have, notice that revenues and revenues are on opposite, thinking back algebraically how we can go about eliminating something. We've got income now over investment, which is our ROI formula. So we basically just decomposed return on investment into return on sales and asset turnover. This approach is known as the DuPont method of profitability analysis. If you've had Lobo or some of the others for some of your finance courses, maybe you have seen this before. It recognizes our two basic ingredients in making profit. If we increase our income per dollar of returns, or we can use assets to generate more revenues, and improvement in one will increase our ROI. The next one we're going to look at is our residual income, or RI. It is an accounting measure of income minus a dollar amount for required return on an accounting measure of investment. So again, what is that required return? It is whatever those investors are wanting to make as a rate. And you can consider it the imputed cost of the investment. The required rate of return times the investment is the imputed cost of the investment. Imputed costs are costs recognized in some situations, but not in the financial accounting. This imputed cost number is like what we've seen in the past, known as opportunity cost. What the business has given up by investing in this subunit and not something else that would have resulted in this imputed return minimum. Okay, so what is our investment into whatever it is we're evaluating? What is the shareholders, stockholders, owner of the company's required rate of return minimum? Multiplying those two together, that is our opportunity cost, and we would subtract that from income to give us a value known as our residual income. Notice that this one's not a ratio. This is going to be in hard dollars here. Some companies favor this residual income because managers can focus on maximizing an absolute dollar amount and not a percentage. So again, it's absolute dollars. What is our income minus our rate of return times our investment? Is there a chance we've got a negative number that could result from this? You betcha. And that would be the negative amount of residual income. RI means that as long as a subunit earns a return in excess of that required rate of return, then the subunit could or should continue on. The next one is our EVA, or economic value added. It's used by many companies. EVA, the formula is after-tax operating income minus our weighted average cost of capital times the result of total assets minus current liabilities. So total assets, that's everything we own, minus only our current liabilities. What does that leave us? What's the result there? That is our long-term debt and our equity, correct? So our weighted average cost of capital, you guys have seen this in prior classes for sure. Weighted average cost of capital, also known as WACC, is our cost of capital. It equals the after-tax average cost of all long-term funds in use. I believe in the past I have supplied a copy of this formula to my other classes. I don't believe it's embedded in these particular PowerPoint slides. When I do the ICPs and load those answers for you guys, I will also try to put up the formula for WAC, okay? In regards to EVA, a couple of other notes. EVA is in essence charging to managers' evaluations the cost associated with their investments in long-term assets and working capital, as they do have cost for their use in terms of debt and equity obligations. There are ways for managers to improve their EVA. You can look through some of the notes in the chapter. Managers at companies like to use this EVA, and they tend to get their WAC calculation from upper management. They tend to compare their actual results of their EVA to their estimated EVA and be able to evaluate or possibly give the feedback about their performance. Lastly, return on sales. Again, I showed you part of this within our DuPont. Return on sales is also known as the income to revenues ratio or the sales ratio. So as you guys have already learned in multiple accounting and finance classes, sometimes there's 2 or 3 names for different things, and this is a prime example. So ROS, or return on sales, or income to revenues ratio, or the sales ratio. It could be called any of those. It is frequently used, it's exceptionally simple to compute, and it is widely understood. It helps us to evaluate how effectively costs are managed. It does not take into account investment. We're only looking at our return on sales. So the amount of income that's generated based on the total sales. So basically we're answering with this particular formula, how many cents in income are being generated for each dollar in sales. Of course, the higher the better. We are going to want a large return on our sales dollars, right? So when you guys are evaluating some of these ratios, not only the ones that you see in this class, but the ones that you see in others, think about what the numbers are you are using and in what, which one's the numerator, which one's the denominator. Do you want the number to be higher or do you want the number to be lower? It all depends on what you're evaluating. So with return on sales, we definitely want it to be higher. Again, this is part of the DuPont that you saw on the earlier slide. It measures how effectively costs are managed. I believe I've already mentioned that. And it is calculated typically by taking operating income or net income and dividing it by revenues, and it is expressed as a percentage. So for example, 500 over 1,000 would be 50%. Here are some examples of what these performance measures would look like. Notice we've got the ROI, the RI, the EVA, and the return on sales. Here, this particular example is putting them in order best to worst. We do have an error here where when they made this particular slide, and I don't think that I can correct it. This 9 is not supposed to be a 9. It needs to have the other side of its parentheses. So again, return on investment, the higher the better. 24% is the highest, 15% is the lowest. Our residual income, notice that all 3 of these are positive numbers. 150,000 is the highest, 60,000 is the lowest. Our economic value added, or EVA, 73,000 is the highest, 15,000 is the lowest. And then again, return on sales, the highest, first place, 21%, our lowest, 16%. Another thing that we have to consider is our time horizon when it comes to our performance measures. And actually, I think I'll skip that for just a second and we'll talk more about the details. I mentioned to you guys earlier that we've got to be very, very specific in regards to what items are being used in the calculations. So how should each one of these measures be computed? There's lots of things we need to consider. What is the time horizon? We are moving in that direction. Which definition of investment will be used, and how shall we calculate various components of each performance measure, such as the measurement of the assets. So in the beginning, choosing that time horizon of the performance measures, it is a very important element. We have got to figure out what time periods we're going to be analyzing. Are we trying to analyze from the beginning of the company? Or are we just looking at last year? Are we looking at a quarter? Are we looking at a month? Those types of questions need to be answered. So it is an important element in designing accounting-based performance measures to choose the time horizon of the performance measures. Keep in mind that when you guys help management evaluate people, that sometimes these managers could take actions that cause short-run increases in these measures that conflict with the long-run interest of the company. Again, you need to be very skeptical. It is one of your skill sets as an accountant that you guys are supposed to always be conservative in nature and look at both sides of the fence. Think too about when you are evaluating these managers and assisting management in doing that, that sometimes you guys are going to have managers that come into a specific position and they're literally picking up where some other manager has left off. So you do not need to necessarily hold them accountable for somebody else's bad behavior and past mistakes. So that's the other side of the fence. Look at both, figure out what you're analyzing, know all the facts, know all the data before you make decisions, or at least make sure that you convey all the pertinent information to management when you are responsible for supplying them with it. Another example of something that management could do, they could curtail their research and development. They could hold off on maintaining equipment, thereby reducing some of their expenses and improving their operating income or net income for that specific period, even though the equipment's going to break down later and the crap's going to hit the fan and we're going to have a lot of expenses and issues in regards to our revenues in a future period. So again, be professionally skeptical. It's best to evaluate managers over multiple years. Also make sure you understand that sometimes there could be time lags in regards to how those results are going to end up showing later in regards to some of their actions. So again, you guys got to be able to think through the process of what's going to happen. All right, so now let's look at each of these measurement details. Again, we've got alternative definitions for our time horizons. We've got to choose the time horizon of the performance measures. Again, multiple periods of the evaluation are sometimes more appropriate. In other words, there's kind of a smoothing effect due to the time that's being involved in the calculation. All four of the ones that we have looked at thus far in this chapter all evaluate one period of time. Again, think of the fact that many of these had income. Are we talking income for a period of a month, a year? What are we looking at? They may also be adapted to evaluate multiple periods of time. Could we not add up multiple years worth of net income? Yes, we could. Could we add up multiple years of operating income? Yes, we could. Benefits of actions taken in the current period may not show up in short-run performance measures. I did mention that. Again, we've got time lags. Sometimes it takes a while for the accounting and how the company is ran to show up in the financial records. If we do it over multi-year analysis, it's kind of smoothed in a way. If managers use the net present value for investment decisions, then using a multiple year return on investment for performance achieves goal congruence. We've talked about goal congruence in chapter 22. Using multiple years also motivates managers to take a long run perspective. Again, if we only use a year or shorter, they know that they are able to manipulate the numbers sometimes, and they are not being forward thinking. They're thinking only about themselves. Again, it's that goal congruence, the what's in it for me. But if we use the multi-year, it's going to show over the long haul what their performance looks like. So it is a benefit to use that. The definitions for the measures. This is what I was mentioning earlier on. What are we going to use as our definitions? Regarding our assets for investment, for the investment part of the calculations, we could use total assets available, all assets. Could we use historical cost, the original purchase price? Could we use book value? Could we use a current number, a appraised value? Yes, we could. So we've got to be very, very, very specific when we define these terms. Could we use just total assets employed? This is all assets minus any assets not currently in use, idle assets, which would also make sure that we would not include any assets that have been purchased or invested in for future expansion. So when we're talking about those capital expenditures for large, major, foregoing projects, we would also subtract out that number. So again, we've got to be very, very specific in our definitions before we calculate our numbers. Could we use total assets employed minus current liabilities? Yes. We could use total assets employed less assets financed by short-term creditors. So we would be looking at only assets that were being provided by long-term creditors and by what? Equity. So if we took total assets and we subtracted out those being financed by current liabilities, then we would be looking at what has been financed by long-term debt and our stockholders' equity, our retained earnings, those types of things. Stockholders' equity, we could assign the liabilities to subunits and deduct from total assets. Again, we could do multiple ways of assigning this value or what numbers to go and look for. One quick thing about this one at the bottom. In regards to stockholders' equity, we're talking about where liabilities are assigned to their subunit, and then we would deduct from the total assets of each subunit. In regards to total assets employed, a couple of notes here. Assets financed by short-term creditors, this is kind of a negative feature. Some managers may use excessive short-term debt, aka buying things on account with accounts payable type vendors and suppliers, or go out and get some type of short-term financing or loans in order to fund items. So again, be skeptical and look into all of the numbers. Define them all in detail, define them all in writing, and use those definitions year after year, because if you don't, you're going to have comparability problems and you're going to have a hard time evaluating what you're doing. Again, I've kind of mentioned this already. What asset measurement are we going to use? Are we going to use current cost, which would be what we could go out today and purchase the same asset at, one that's identical to the one that's currently held, which again would be like possibly some type of market price that we could find. What about the gross value of the fixed assets, that original purchase price, that historical cost? Or are we going to use the assets at their net book value, which is historical cost minus their accumulated depreciation to date? Historical cost is used to calculate return on investment, and there is always a question whether to use gross or net book value. Net book value is the measure most commonly used by companies for internal performance evaluation. So again, that's historical cost minus accumulated depreciation to date to get that NBV. When you're doing your homework and on the test, make sure you read the details very, very specifically and calculate your particular parts of the measures correctly. Choosing target levels of performance, we need to consider that we have got historical cost-based measures that we're using, and we can go about establishing target ROIs with those past performance numbers and consider those initiatives for improvement and cost reduction and revenue and sales increases, and select what we want to be the target performance ratio result. We, of course, will include those continuous improvement targets in our calculations, increasing sales, decreasing cost, better managing our taxes. Those types of things can all be considered in our numbers that we're using to establish our target ROIs and our other measures of performance. So management may ask you to tweak some things in order to help them establish those target performance numbers that they will then use to evaluate managers against. We can also use those balanced scorecards to establish targets. Recall that many of those balanced scorecards initiatives, those 4 distinct areas, that we have financial measures and non-financial measures. Okay, so besides these ROIs and the RIs and the EVAs, we can also aid management in putting together some targets that are non-financial and use those as well when we evaluate the performance of our managers. Choosing the timing of the feedback definitely depends on how critical the information is for the success of the organization. We have talked in past classes in regards to management by exception. If we are talking major bucks and major problems, it is exceptionally critical to get this information to those on a need-to-know basis so that the feedback can be given and we can seek out ways to improve or fix whatever may be going wrong. If we've got things that are going exceptionally well maybe that information needs to be passed along too. Again, we're talking best practices, information and knowledge that needs to be transferred to other divisions or other departments, and the faster we get that good information to them, the faster they're going to be able to improve in those particular areas as well. And we need to consider the management level receiving the feedback. Again, we could have information overload, so we don't need to bombard them with too much information all at once. It needs to be very defined as to who needs to get what and how fast they need to get it, because if we give some folks too much, there's no way they're going to be able to process it all. The sophistication of the organization's information technology system definitely plays a key role in many organizations' success. When you guys get to the Acc4060 class, you'll talk quite a bit about how the AIS systems can help organizations streamline their operations, become more efficient, become more effective, and supply information to management on a need-to-know basis, faster, more accurately. You guys are going to be working with lots of systems when you get out there. Hopefully you're going to get to work with some of these multi-million-dollar ones that are exceptionally sophisticated. Some of them literally have dashboards like a cockpit for an airplane with all types of parameters and ranges and data coming through on a minute-by-minute basis. And we can use those tools to better run the organization, highlighting things that need to be drawn to management's attention. So think back again to that management by exception, and those AISs can help us do that. There are some additional difficulties that are faced by multinational companies. Again, we are not going to be calculating in this particular class exchange rates and things like that. But as the global economy continues to expand, you all are going to be more and more challenged as the years go by. So the more time you spend informing yourself, you should be a lifelong learner. There's a lot of different things that need to be considered. I'm quite certain that some of you guys are going to come back and get your MBAs or your Macs, and you will have some global classes in regards to global management. So we have talked about tariffs and taxes and culture and some of these other things that are showing up here on this particular slide when we talked about the transfer pricing chapter. So we've got economic types of difficulties. We've got legal. Again, they've got different laws on how to do things in other countries. They've got different environmental laws. They've got different employment laws. They've got all kinds of other laws that we have to adhere to when we are in their country doing business. We also have different political systems all over the world, different social and cultural environments across the globe. And so these are things that need to be taken into consideration when we do business on a multinational level. There are a couple of web pages that I might mention here for anybody that may possibly start working for a global company. There's a few here in town that I'll just mention right off the top of my head before I give these other websites. But for example, Aztec Industries, which is located over at the Rossville, Georgia and Chattanooga, Tennessee state line. They have locations and customers and sales divisions that focus on global sales, and that would be one you could go check out their particular web page. But when companies go and look into doing business elsewhere in the world, they need to consider these factors right here. And there are web pages that you can go to that have been developed by many of our U.S. government divisions. So for example, the Chamber of Commerce, there is a U.S. Chamber of Commerce that develops a lot of data and information in regards to some of these distinct areas and doing business with other countries. There is also some information that has been gathered by the World Bank. Right off the top of my head, there was one other one I was going to tell you about. But if you've got to do some research into the types of difficulties that you or your company may face when they decide to go global, you can look at a particular one called the Corruption Index, because I assure you business is a whole lot different in Russia than it is in the United States. And the Corruption Index has a lot of data in it regarding many of these distinct areas right here and how things are done in other countries. So it might be something you might look into in the future. Import quotas and tariffs range widely from country to country. Again, our country and other countries are constantly negotiating things. We understand supply and demand after having economics classes, import and export and tariffs, and those transfer prices and taxes like we talked about in another chapter. So all this affects us. Availability of materials and skilled labor. Definitely issues in some of these other countries, but as global economic trade expands, we are going to have more and more skilled labor around the globe that you guys are going to be competing with for jobs. Materials are going to be being sourced from different areas, and if the materials are cheaper due to skilled labor and supply of those raw materials in other countries, then that too will affect our jobs here in the United States, as well as our costs. So maybe for stockholders it's better, but maybe for the folks in our own country, not so good, because it's going to be a competition for jobs. Infrastructure issues is also a really big deal if you guys have been paying attention to the news lately. Obama has recently visited Africa, and there is going to be an infusion of cash in the billions over a set time frame. I want to say it's maybe 5 years, and we are basically going to be helping Africa to not only develop their infrastructure, but literally launch it in certain areas so as to help them build their economy there. Divisions operating in different countries account for their performance in different currencies. This is a major issue. You guys should have seen, if not already, you will, in your intermediate courses, how the foreign currency exchange rates affect the final consolidated financial statements for many of these multinational companies. It adds a whole new ball of wax to doing our financial reporting because of all those additional calculations that have to be done for numerous numbers, numerous accounts that have been affected in some way, shape, or form by those exchange rates. The fact that that's going on, also, of course, affects our performance measurement results. So keep that in mind. In regards to distinguishing between the performance of managers and their subunits, the performance evaluation of a manager should be distinguished from the performance evaluation of that manager's subunit, such as a division of the company. The reason for this is to recognize that a company may put the most skilled division manager in charge of the division with the poorest return in an effort to improve that division, and that may take years. Like I mentioned several minutes ago, there's a lag time there. What if the person that was in that position before has done some things and they are just now coming to the top? All right, we cannot judge the current manager, evaluate him negatively based on that result. And that result is from a prior manager. So we've got to be able to distinguish, or at least notate, the history and how those items that have occurred in the past could affect the current performance measurements result. We do need to be able to motivate managers, and I have briefly mentioned at the very, very beginning how we can somehow tie the pay or the incentive that comes on the paycheck to performance. And we need to consider, though, that we've got to be skeptical, because when we do this, creating these incentives, it could not only be just tied to the paycheck, it could be stock bonuses, it could be stock options. I mean, there's a lot of ways that corporations can incentivize their managers. So we've got to be careful, because when we do that, we know how bad greed can be, and when there's greed, we're going to have risk. So creating these incentives definitely imposes risk upon the organization. So it is an inherent trade-off between creating the incentives and imposing the risk, and that's the reason why I mentioned to you guys that you've got to remain professionally skeptical and understand both sides of the fence and how the numbers are working. An incentive should be some reward for performance. An incentive may create an environment in which suboptimal behavior may occur. The goals of the manager, or excuse me, the goals of the firm, again, think of those long-term strategic goals, may be sacrificed or put to the wayside in order for that manager to meet their own personal goals. And when we're talking about this, typically we're talking about their short-term needs for cash or stock or whatever. So we've got to consider that's a possibility. The motivation for having some salary and some performance-based compensation is to balance out the benefit of incentives against the extra cost of imposing risk on a manager. So if we have got some salary and then some other type of performance-based compensation, think stock or stock options, in a way, if we've got that stock, typically they're going to want to hold on to that for a while, and when they hold it, they're going to be looking at their long range. So we're kind of bringing them back in to thinking on the long term, not just the short term. We have what is called moral hazard. You guys have most likely heard of this in your business law class. If not, maybe one or two other ones, maybe a BMGT 3150. Moral hazard describes a situation in which an employee prefers to exert less effort compared with the effort the owner desires, because the owner cannot accurately monitor and enforce the employee's effort. The intensity of the incentives, of course, are we going to think that's going to be highly correlated to our risk? How large that incentive component is of a manager's compensation should be relative to their salary component. Trade-off between considerations of sensitivity and risk on the one hand and our congruence of goals on the other determines the effective intensity of incentives placed on each measure of performance. You may take another peek into the book in regards to setting those incentives. Again, benchmarks. These are metrics that correspond to the best practices of organizations and may be available inside or outside of the organization. I mentioned to you guys earlier in the semester how some of the large global accounting firms, for example, E&Y, they do studies and they develop these benchmark reports where they go out and they study particular corporations within an industry. They benchmark the results for the industry. They change the names to hide the names of the guilty and the innocent as far as results go, and then those reports are able to be purchased. I would believe some of the ones who partake in the benchmarking probably get them at a discount, if not free. But there are ways outside of an organization to obtain benchmarks or best practice information. Inside the company, there's going to have to be somebody doing the benchmarking and generating those reports. Managers need to do two things when designing the measures used to evaluate performance of individual employees. They need to design the performance measures for activities that require multiple tasks. Again, we're not just going to be looking at one distinct thing. We're looking at multiple activities. So we've talked earlier about this return issue, considering income as the return. Those multiple activities are generating those revenues, but then those different costs and expenses that went into generating those revenues. We need to design performance measures for activities done in teams. So the more that we can involve in how the measures are being developed, the actual numbers being generated by more than one group, that helps us to get additional information as well as motivate those teams of people to perform. Employers want employees to allocate their time and effort intelligently among various tasks or aspects of their jobs. We did speak about this in our earlier chapter 22. We want motivation. We want them to be working towards the goals and objectives as deemed important by management. At the same time, the employees feeling good about themselves and meeting their own personal objectives simultaneously. So we're talking about goal congruence. We talked about effort, and we talked about the fact that we want not only physical exertion, but we want intelligence, knowledge, skill set, experience, education. We want all that being brought to the table by the folks working for us. A team of people achieves better results than individual employees acting alone. Okay, so everybody's heard it. Two brains better than one. So the more that we can involve multiple people in whatever's being evaluated, the better the results are going to be over time. Many companies reward employees on teams based on how well their teams perform. I will give you an example of when I was at Southern Tool Steel. We would have monthly goals, and many times the monthly goals is driven quite a lot by the actual salespeople. So I'm talking about the sales goal. And when I say sales, I mean the revenues that were for what was literally shipped out that month. And when we educated the warehouse staff, who was the shipping and receiving, and our data entry people, and everyone in our accounting departments, and they understood that the sales people were the driver, the main driver of that, but that everybody else had jobs that tied into generating those revenues and getting those goods shipped to the customers. Everybody worked better together. They also knew that from the accounting department, the shipping and receiving, the data entry, even the receptionist, they knew that if they could handle the autonomy of decision making in regards to some issue that arose during that time frame, that if they could handle it without bothering the salesperson who was on the phone trying to push those sales to those customers, they knew the sales results would be higher. So in training and communicating that to folks, the team will achieve better results, especially if you communicate how everyone is interrelated into getting that performance up there. Executive compensation plans, definitely based on both financial and non-financial performance measures, and include a mix of base salary, annual incentives such as cash bonuses, long-run incentives, and stock such as stock options. If you guys will pay attention, many times the Times Free Press will run a report, typically annually, highlighting some of this information here for some of our publicly traded entities here in town. For example, CBL and Aztec and Chatham and many, many others. If you guys will watch the dashboards or look in the Bloomberg Lab, we've got several of those companies pulled up. If you wanted to learn more about some of this information, how these executive compensation plans are put together and what the details of them are, you can do some digging around on the SEC's webpage under the Edgar system. You can go pull up documents that companies are required to file that disclose some of this information, including their annual reports and such things as proxy statements. You can also go look on their web pages and look under investors and find out some of how these plans are put together. Well-designed plans use a compensation mix that balances out risk, which we have talked about. Again, when people get greedy, they can start manipulating numbers and performance. The effect of uncontrollable factors on the performance measure and hence compensation, that's that risk part, with short-run and long-run incentives to achieve the firm's goals. So well-designed plans, there are people out there that do nothing but work on incentive and compensation plans. Lastly, we've got our strategy and levers of control portion of this particular chapter. Our performance evaluation measures help managers track their progress toward achieving a company's strategic goals. And we need to use those items. Because these measures help diagnose whether or not a company is performing to expectations, they are collectively called diagnostic control systems. So we're diagnosing how we are doing, and we're going to use them to plan, direct, and control how we continue to run or manage our company. Companies motivate managers by holding them accountable and rewarding them for meeting goals. We basically kind of talked about that. We're doing performance evaluation measures, and we're going to analyze them and compare them to historical performance as well as what our target measures were. And then we're going to be able to somehow motivate them and reward them, typically with some type of incentive plan. To prevent unethical and outright fraudulent behavior, companies balance the push for performance resulting from the diagnostic control systems with 3 other levers of control. So notice that there are 4. We want to have boundaries, we want to have beliefs, and we want to have interactive control systems. Each one of these is important, and all of them need to be monitored. Levers should be interdependent and collectively represent a living system of business conduct. In regards to our boundary systems, we're basically setting the parameters or the standards of behavior and the codes of conduct that we expect all those employees to work within. So again, the perimeters or the boundary, the standards of behavior and the codes of conduct that we expect from all of the employees, not just management, this is everybody. It highlights actions that are off limits. A code of conduct describes appropriate and inappropriate individual behaviors. Many times companies are going to have not only a code of conduct, but also a code of ethics. So we're talking about the culture and the things that we deem that they should all be responsible for acting and behaving within those parameters. In regards to our belief systems, these basically articulate the company's mission and vision and purpose, but also the core values of the company. We're talking a lot about company culture here and that tone at the top. They describe the accepted norms and patterns of behavior expected of all managers and other employees when interacting with one another, with shareholders, with customers, with the community. Sometimes these are formal and spelled out, and sometimes some of these are informal and not spelled out, but basically shown to others by the way others act. So again, tone at the top. They need to talk the talk and walk the walk. Interactive control systems are the formal information systems that managers use to focus the company's attention on and the learning on key strategic issues. So again, interactive tells us a lot. It is a system that we can constantly interact with. It is keeping up with what's going on, and we can use it to guide our planning, directing, and controlling decisions. It helps managers to create an open dialogue and eliminate or manage an excessive focus on diagnostic control systems. It helps us to track strategic uncertainties that business face. And that is the end. That is our fourth lever. That is chapter 23. You guys, I will try to get the ICPs to you as soon as possible. There are a couple of errors in the publisher's results or the answers on those, so I want to go and double check all 3 chapters worth. I will try to get that done, if not tonight once I get home, or sometime tomorrow between 3 meetings that I've got scheduled. Definitely make sure you spend some time on your homework for chapter 23, making sure that you can do all of those calculations, ROI, RI, EVA, return on sales, and that you understand many of these terms and definitions that we see here and what you've seen in the PowerPoint slides. And I will see you next Tuesday for the final exam, and we will start at 6 o'clock, so hopefully you'll have time to catch your breath and eat a snack or grab some dinner before that test. Like I did mention the other day, it does have 100 questions on it. See you soon. Email me if you need to.